To give you some clear perspective for why robotic process automation has become so important to global enterprises, I'd like to walk through some history and drivers. The primary drivers for RPA are the need for constant company growth, labor arbitrage has been exhausted, there have been challenges with BPOs, IT changes can be prohibitive. As a direct result of the internet and smartphones, companies have easier access to customers, and this creates more work than ever. That can be a good problem to have, but the work still needs to be done. Customer expectations are increasing. They want things better, cheaper, and faster. This competitive global marketplace requires agility and speed in order for a company to survive. Employee job satisfaction and retention have become important because companies around the world are often competing for the same human resources, and nobody wants to be stuck in a dead-end, boring job. Finally, the fact that better RPA tools are available is playing a role as well. Let's take a closer look at these first 4 items. First, the need for company growth. There's absolutely a need for constant growth in a company. There's an old saying, if you're not growing, you're dying. Essentially, if companies can reduce costs and increase revenue, they get more profit. Another popular saying is, each dollar you earn contributes only a small percentage to your profit, because that earned dollar gets split up across many different expenses. But each dollar you save goes directly to the bottom line, because money you don't spend is not consumed by expenses. That's why RPA is so attractive, because it can reduce costs while at the same time increasing revenue. And that means more profit. The next item, labor arbitrage, has been exhausted. Let's take a look at that. Before we can unpack what that means, let's define labor arbitrage. Labor arbitrage can take several different forms. One form is when workers from less developed countries proactively relocate to countries where there is more available work or where wages are higher. This depends on loose immigration policies and easily obtainable work visas. A second form is employee-sponsored immigration. Here, employers provide foreign workers with temporary work visas, often paying them less than the native workers. The way the H-1B visa program is supposed to work is that it allows companies to give work visas to foreign workers in cases where the companies can't find local workers who have the right skills. What really ended up happening, though, is that companies just went out and hired foreign workers because they could get them at lower prices. And this was a way to offset strict immigration policies. Finally, outsourcing or offshoring is when a business cuts jobs in one country and then employs foreign workers in their own home country to perform some or all of the same tasks as the cut employees, and the company pays a lower tax rate and has to pay for fewer benefits. Now, ultimately, all forms of labor arbitrage drive labor costs down in a higher wage country, which increases profits for companies. Labor arbitrage most often occurs when it represents a financial advantage for businesses. It's usually more profitable to do business using workers in certain, usually foreign locations due to things like tax policies, immigration policies, minimum wage laws, and workers' rights laws that require companies to pay for health insurance and paid leave, things like that. Now, some history behind labor arbitrage. In the 1980s, U.S. companies decided to start outsourcing their non-core processes. That's things like HR, customer service, IT, etc. They wanted to concentrate their scarce human resources on the company's core competencies. That's just a fancy way of referring to the main things that the company does. What differentiates them from their competitors? They wanted to strategically outsource activities which are of no critical strategic need. Now, this work initially went to companies in the same national economy, meaning that U.S. companies initially outsourced to other U.S. companies. So maybe there was a U.S. company that was really good at doing customer service, and companies like GE and Kellogg's and Chevrolet would all send their customer service needs to that one outsourced company. They wanted to decrease their long-term capital investments, which simply means kind of pay as you go instead of having big long-term financial commitments. The goal was to achieve sustainable competitive advantage and business improvement. But a big part of that was cutting costs, which of course brings more profit. In the 1990s, US companies started offshoring to European countries to increase the outsourcing wage and tax benefits. So of course they're maximizing their ability to cut costs. In the 2000s, they began offshoring to what they referred to as low-wage countries. This labor arbitrage helped to further offset costs, which means cutting costs and more profit. The work then went to India and China, Philippines, Israel, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Singapore. And as the work went to any given low-wage country, and that country began to build up their infrastructure, and other companies tried to use the same human resources, the lower wages became higher in those countries for those reasons. So companies simply moved the work to the next low-wage country. So what does it mean when I say labor arbitrage is exhausted? Looking at this graphic gives you a good sense of it. It started off that paying US workers was too expensive, so the jobs moved to some European countries, but then the wages went higher there. So they moved to some Asian countries, and the wages went higher there. And then they moved to some South American countries, and the wages eventually went higher there. When we talk about proactive relocation to countries with better work and wages, immigration policies have been recently tightening up. When we talk about employer-sponsored immigration, the same thing applies with immigration, but also US public opinion is changing. Outsourcing is becoming less socially acceptable. And when we talk about outsourcing and offshoring to these low-wage countries, as I mentioned before, all the low-wage countries have been used up. There's nowhere else to go that can sustain the work. So what that boils down to is that companies are no longer getting a profit boost from the savings of labor arbitrage. Corporate leaders are searching for the next 1% to 2% profit boost to keep growth moving. Because as we discussed, constant growth is mandatory. Otherwise, the company's stock prices will decline. So what's the solution? Software robots are less expensive than humans. So let's drill into BPO challenges. Some history about BPOs. Instead of achieving more efficiency, one single function at a time, companies would redesign complete business processes to increase value. And what that really meant was to cut costs across the whole value chain. This resulted in what we call business process outsourcing, or BPO. And BPO has turned out to be one of the most significant business trends and largest IT growth sectors in the past few years. Some challenges for BPOs are that recently there's a looming prospect of increasing barriers to offshoring from things like a potential border tax on services, immigration reform, and reform of the H-1 visa process that I talked about before. If all of these things come to pass, that will lead to higher costs for companies, and that means less profit. In addition, offshoring has consequences such as time zone delays that can affect productivity, something called outsourcing bloat, where when the per unit labor cost in the offshoring model is lower, but it results in other problems such as incurring more labor, less communication, and less alignment. Now naturally, a BPO's self-interest is going to be to maximize the number of people and hours worked on any given process, because then they'll make more money. They've got a profit-centered mindset as well. We hear comments throughout the industry like outsourced FTEs will cheerfully respond to system problems, but not address the underlying issues that caused the problems. Modern studies have shown that companies who fix those underlying systemic problems are operating with 30 to 40% fewer FTEs. Today's business challenges are more complex than ever. The need for speed, agility, and quality has never been greater. Profit and growth conversations I was talking about before can no longer be about outsourcing. They must be about transforming and enabling organizations to meet any challenges they face. The solution? Software robots can reduce the use of outsourcing and offshoring as labor arbitrage by bringing work back onshore to be managed by humans interfacing with a digital workforce. Recent studies show that organizations can lower their labor costs more dramatically by improving productivity than they could by moving the work offshore. So what that means is the last 10 or 20 years has been focused on reducing costs by offshoring. The next 10 years, however, will be a story of increasing productivity in the workforce. How does RPA play into that? Software robots are more productive than humans. Let's talk about IT changes being prohibitive. At the end of the day, IT is simply too busy working on new, core competence business ideas. IT system integrations are risky and they could create new problems. IT changes are expensive. They require many layers of people and organization to implement. IT changes take too long due to availability, complexity, testing, and things like that. The IT staff might lack skills and knowledge required to modify legacy systems. Financial and insurance companies use a lot of mainframe-based hardware and software, and in this day and age, software developers would rather learn the new sexy skills instead of all the old technology. So this can be a real problem in some organizations. So we might think that business could implement robotic process automation on its own. But to do so, they would use existing systems with minimal, if any, system integration work. But they'd be using IT infrastructure and support. So that requires less overall involvement from IT. An important point to consider, though, is that to succeed with RPA, business employees will need to level up their tech skills. And that's exactly why I've created this series of courses. So to summarize, hopefully these make more sense now. There's a need for constant company growth. Labor arbitrage has been exhausted. There are many challenges with the BPO model. IT changes can be prohibitive. And like we discussed, the internet and smartphones have made it much easier for companies to find and reach customers. And that generates more work than ever. Customers have expectations, better, faster, cheaper. This new competitive global marketplace requires unprecedented agility and speed. And of course, we've got employee job satisfaction and retention. And as you're going to see, there are better RPA tools that can provide astonishing results. So let's move on and see what it takes to implement RPA in an organization.